Hello, I'm going to do the lecture for week 3, goals and interests. And I have a lot of notes in front of me, and I'm going to cover, of course, this idea of goals and multiple goals and the complexity of goals. And this is really rooted in chapter 3 of Hawker and Wilmot's interpersonal conflict book. So you can see where we are kind of merging and using some of the terminology from that book. This also is really the next step in how we are setting up how we perceive a conflict and how we view a conflict. Remember, in week 1, we started with really trying to look at how conflict can benefit or help a relationship grow, and the necessary elements of a functional conflict for a functional and productive relationship. And then we moved to week 2, where we added a lot of intercultural communication. And I know I put up extra videos for week 2, but I really wanted to get you as many different ways to think about what's happening in a dialogue, in a conversation where culture is impacting the salience of that interaction. So we really were in this place where we were in the nature of conflict, right? We want to see what are people's perceptions and metaphors and culture and gender. We want to know what are the triggering events that, or the history and context of the situation or the relationship. And we were really looking at that definition by Hawker and Wilmot and defining interpersonal conflict, which is an express struggle between at least two parties with incompatible goals, scarce resources, and interference who perceive, I always forget that word, perceive, who perceive, and it's important because that's like one of the key words in this: incompatible goals, scarce resource, interference from others in achieving their goal. And the word goal is twice in this definition. And here we are at week 3, goals, interests, and goals. And so that means we're going to really be clarifying how we're framing conflicts, or how to even frame a conflict. Reframing is often a kind of little buzzword we hear when we're trying to find compliance or clarify with others. Reframing is a different type of tool than framing, and so we'll look at that. We're really looking at that clarification of how we're going to get satisfied. Where is the satisfaction and the relief through the dialogue, and how are we considering the incompatibility of the scarce resources and the differences in the parties involved in the conflict, and really acknowledging and tolerating differences. And those differences are usually based in the different goals that people bring to the situation. And we really want to emphasize that goals change. You might have multiple goals. Some more, maybe you have priorities with other goals. So one pushes higher to the surface, but the truth is might have multiple goals you're trying to achieve through the conflict. And then, just to make matters even more complex, goals change through dialogue. So we might start off with certain goals, and for unintentional reasons, or the unfolding information that we're getting, our goals might shift and change, and priorities might change. And this is why this chapter is really important, but also it is a very difficult kind of thing to grasp onto and then think about how you would maneuver through a situation. Okay, and then this week, we also are going to start really diving into how are we self-regulating and managing emotions, understanding the experience of being flooded, the kind of hijacking that happens when we get an attack or we feel like we're in danger or someone we are attached to, and how do our needs what do we need that we can that pulls us into this emotional place where we feel like we might be really losing or in danger. So we want to address that emotional piece. And I'm going to start adding in a few self-soothing, which is a Gottman word. We want to talk about self-soothing. We want to talk about Becky Kennedy a little bit today. And if you don't remember, Becky Kennedy had one of the videos from week 1 on parenting, and I put her video in there, and she says this in the talk as well. But the way that we show up to help children through emotional moments or mistakes we make as parents can be the way we can translate that and use that in other situations. So this is an organizational leadership class for conflict management. So we want to really focus in on our experiences in organizations and workplaces, even though I also want to talk about romantic relationships. And I also want to talk about family, parenting, friendships, those things as well. But when we're in organizations, one of the ways that we are navigating those spaces, whether we have power or we don't have power, doesn't mean we can't show up as in leadership roles, even if we don't have positions of power, uh, to help ourselves navigate the competitive elements of workplaces, kind of that first impulse that every conflict is a competition and someone has to lose for someone to win. We often feel like we're in the minutia of or the rapids. I'll use the metaphor of rapids, and since it's summer and there's river rafting out there. Uh, the rapids that we are trying to get through, we don't those external forces that we're dealing with. But even more importantly, this week is the first week where we're really also trying to get a manager a tool. So let's say you do have a position of power and there you are the person facilitating or managing a small group or a group of people, and or you have some type of responsibility in a meeting to host a meeting. There'll be a conflict. How are you, as the person with the kind of label of in charge, leaning into that conflict as an opportunity to get your team to build trust, for team members to be seen? What can we learn from that? Because often we get put into places of leadership or management, but we don't really have the skills of how to handle the conflicts, but you are the one responsible for the conflicts in your team. And that can be really frustrating if the person in that role uh, doesn't really might in their own personal life have a tendency to avoid conflict, and they're in charge and they're going to try and just sweep it off and sweep it away, or are very pessimistic about conflict, and therefore they're in a place of avoidance, or accommodating the more extrovert, proverbial squeaky wheel, and not really using the conflict as a way to build trust in your teams. And that means that if we're going to really bring that element into this lecture, my little tiny desk lecture, we need to start thinking about these assessment. How are we assessing a conflict? Last week, I gave you communication cultures, elements of time, gender to think about assessing what's happening in a dialogue. Uh, but we also have Hawker and Wilmot's assessment guide, and I think that's in the end of chapter 7. Uh, If I got that wrong, please let me know. But the conflict assessment guide, basically the book is the assessment guide, interpersonal conflict. But Hawker and Wilmot actually list it all out in one of the chapters. And that's what this is here. I can put this up for you to find. But we already did the nature of conflict. Now we're in goals, and through the rest of the class, we'll be following a lot of that model. But I also talked about the progress triangle and the idea of substance, procedure, and relationship. That was in week 1, where we looked at the progress triangle. And this one by Daniels and Walker is a collaborative approach. I feel like if you're really diving into the collaborative approach to assessing a model, that's when you're facilitating a group and you want them to do a full analysis of what is the conflict, the substance of it, what's actually like the surface levels that everyone can perceive is going on as the conflict, the procedure, and then the relationship dimensions of the triangle. But you're asking for you are really facilitating a group discussion to fill that in and brainstorm and develop it. And then you move to interests and goals, and really trying to get us into more, um, what's one thing to think about, like to really find out where can goals line up, where are interests lined up, and where are we different. And not that difference is bad, and not that everything being the same is necessarily good. We always want to be careful to not fall into that, because often conflict management traditionally, and because of our impulse to compete, we're moving through these conflicts with the assumption that if we can all just agree, somehow then we'll be okay. And then end up in a debate, like hashtag facts or hashtag my evidence is better than your evidence. And we end up in this debate. That is different than managing a conflict or facilitating a group to be more task focused instead of, and that means like as a team, we're on a single task. So we want to really look at the fallacy of similarity as being the way to solve this conflict. Like if you could just agree with me on the facts, then we can now march forward on whatever it is that the conflict is about. Okay. So I just wanted to add that as a little moment there. Okay, so let's talk about the fact that this is called interests and goals, and the difference between the word interests and the difference of goals. Uh, Interests, we want to really think about interests as the way that we are motivated to engage in the dialogue or the task, right? This is our motivation, and that means that we are going to be connected to this idea of needs. What do we need in a conflict? Meaning and we use the word need on purpose. The word need comes to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And maybe some of you have studied Maslow's hierarchy of needs it comes up in all different types of areas of study. We use it in conflict as well, and in communication. When we identify needs, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a pyramid. You could just kind of Google image search and see it. But it has at the bottom of the pyramid the first needs that all humans need, which is the functioning of our bodies and health, which includes like that we need water and we need food, substance, and oxygen, right? Whatever it is for the functioning of our body. Then we move into safety needs. And just to make a note about the safety needs, when we think about safety needs, this is not just where we can lay our head down and actually sleep, because sleep is an essential physiological need for our health. but it's what are the spaces that you're occupying that you feel you can be safe in, whether that's how you walk through your front door and you feel like you are home and you are safe in your home. How is it to walk into a workplace, um, or a neighborhood that you live in, or the country that you live in, or the state of the universe that you live in, right? Like we can get really narrow to really high up. And the complexity of safety also extends to our identity and the safety of our identity. So if a group of people that you've never met before and you hear news that they aren't safe or they get attacked or an individual is attacked and you feel an identity connection to that group, however you define it, whether it's similarity of a label that you feel like you have to deal with as well, and then you see a group being attacked for that label, you might feel like your safety is in danger right in the safety of your own home. And this is why some people like say, you need to turn off the news, right? Because somehow in your own home, you are feeling unsafe because of what happened somewhere else to a group of people you never met. But the identity connection is so strong, it affects your own well-being in your own space. And I'm not saying turn off the news. I'm just saying that's often why some people say, I can't handle that, or I have compassion fatigue because of that safety need is being violated. And remember, in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we need water and food and oxygen, and then we need to be safe. Like it is, even though it is an essential physiological need for the health of our bodies, it gets its own band in Maslow's needs. And remember, this is still to really think about your interests in a conflict or a relationship or a situation, right? If we are trying to define what are your interests or the other person's interests, and that empathetic piece that we're bringing in is to really understand these needs that we have and the ever-changing needs. Once our safety needs are fulfilled, then we move up to the third level, which is belonging. That's our relationships and also a part of our identity, right? It's funny how these are all kind of intertangled into each other. And there's some kind of spectrum to it. But our relationship needs, if I asked you, tell me who you are, tell me about yourself, and you started talking about who you are as your relationships to others. If I were to do that, I would say, oh, let me tell you about myself. I'm a mom. I have two daughters and I'm in a blended family and I have several stepchildren, bonus kids that I was blessed with in this life. And then I'm also a daughter, and I'm a sister, and I'm a professor. Like every time I use one of these labels to define who I am, you can feel the relationship dimension, the belonging to family and friends and my work that define who I am. So belonging is really important. And it's interesting that in our modern age, with the direct link to social media, the feeling of belonging or that need to belong by who we follow or who is following us has actually increased our loneliness, even though it's a communication device that is there to help us connect and feel belonging. We actually get pulled into this feeling easily into a feeling of isolation. And the epidemic of loneliness is pretty severe. And we can talk about the fact that social media, even though it has components where we can interact, is actually a mass media product. And you are more a witness to it, even if you participate by posting or DMing, and even if you get a reply, uh, it almost emphasizes the loneliness, even in those elements of connectedness, because it's so limited in the way we can connect. And remember that impulse that we're all dealing with to compete and compare. And that's why this class is more focused on how are we going to use conflicts or situations or all of these kind of informations to bring us closer together to fulfill that belonging. And that's really important. Okay. So that's what I want to say about Maslow's uh first three levels. The top two levels of the pyramid, self-esteem needs and self-actualization, get very individual to each person. Uh, the other ones have more culture bases, or actually, self-esteem needs is very culture based, uh, driving into how different we all are, as we talked about in week two. So, self-esteem needs, some cultures, I'll just make a note about this. Some cultures for self-esteem needs will say, I'm going to build my child's self-esteem through driving them to be motivated to reach for more, that they should not feel like even in an accomplishment or a win, there should still be more to do. And so this kind of driving towards self-esteem is driving to the award, to the punctuation, to the accomplishment, to the graduation, to, oh, and the Olympics are coming up. So to getting those medals. And even the way that there's these kind of sub steps to getting to an ultimate goal. There's all these kind of awards and bookmarking of events to show that you're still accomplishing and reaching and reaching. Of just for me as an example, if I was in this kind of culture group, which I am, I would say it's the dominant culture group of a more capitalist-based society, is that I got I graduated from high school, then where am I going to go to college? And then you go to college and you get a bachelor degree. And then even before you finish the bachelor degree, it's what kind of job are you going to get? What are you going to do? But after that, it's moving to, should I get another degree, get a master's degree? And then after a master's degree, you get the PhD. And then after the PhD, you're supposed to be on this career track in academia to become a tenured professor. And if you are lucky enough to get a position, a tenure track position, you're basically like starting your PhD all over again from the very beginning. And there's all these steps in the academic institution to reaching tenure. And then even when you reach tenure, there's more levels even after that. It's endless. Uh, till it feels endless. And there's all these defenses and writing and peer evaluations and things that are happening along the way that you're trying to get this achievement. And so in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, self-esteem is established by how you are moving through and never really reaching an end. And this is why retirement looks like you're hitting a brick wall, or retirement is sometimes put off, or because what you're saying is, ta-da, I'm done. But if you've been spending your whole life since kindergarten in this cycle, that feels almost like death, and being obsolete. So some people don't transition well or can look at retirement as an obstacle, a self-esteem obstacle. Self-actualization is, well, oh, okay, wait, no, I'm not done with self-esteem because I didn't do the other culture group of way children are raised to define their self-esteem. And that is through this need for um, responsibility, that you are never really told you're doing anything correctly. You're not really ever given an award or is celebrated in this punctuation mark. Uh, it's more that you know your self-esteem is built through how you sacrifice for others, what you're willing to give up, even for yourself or for other, and then you know you are, you're doing well when you're given more responsibility, when you're gifted a responsibility. So this might look like I'm not given an award at the end of reaching my degree. I'm actually given, oh, now you can be on this, you can be a chair of a committee. Now you can have the keys to the store and you're in charge of closing it up every night for the family. You are, whatever it is, you're given this responsibility, and there's not really a lot of fanfare. There's not a lot of punctuation mark. It's almost like just a normal day, and you're given this huge responsibility. You made it, and that's where the self-esteem is, as you move through those culture groups. So maybe some of that resonates. Maybe you can see some blending. Maybe you can see a conflict with different parenting styles. Maybe your dad came from one culture group and your other parent came from another culture group. And all of a sudden you are seeing why there was some conflict in the parents' raising style. Okay, self-actualization at the top of Maslow's needs is really, no one can really define that for you. And this is often where intrapersonal conflict comes in, as we are trying to really figure out what's our purpose, or how do we feel fulfilled in life, as the hours, the days, and the weeks and the months tick by. How are we measuring our life so that we feel like we have purpose and connection? That is self-actualization. I like to think of self-actualization as the pursuit of happiness. And how are you entering flow in your life? How do you feel like you have flow? And for those of you who've experienced flow, where there's almost this suspension of time and space, and you are in perfect alignment with the activity without having to even think about it, and yet you're excelling. Athletes often experience this kind of high when they're in flow, and in fact, the example from Simone Biles, in the previous Olympics, she had to step down because she couldn't get flow, and she was too much into her thinking place. She was afraid of a debilitating injury, and had to kind of step away because she couldn't get that flow. And we do see that sometimes you could have someone at the very top of their game and they all of a sudden get in their head and they almost kind of get in this frozen place where they can't remember the steps. Uh, and we all experience this in different ways, whether you are an artist uh, or with other things that you've done. I'd love to hear some good examples, that or music. Oh, and that movie Soul, from Pixar, was kind of playing around with what is flow. That's self-actualization. That's what we're really talking about there. Okay. That brings us back to interest. That was like, okay, we were on interest, and then we went to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and now we're back to interest, and we'll kind of move along. So with interest, we're really trying to get to the deeper needs, and it's really for yourself. You should be really knowing what even your own interests in a conflict are, and what is motivating you, and what is your deeper need, and how it connects. And then being curious about the other parties in the situation. What do you think their interests are? Now, you don't want to fall into fundamental attribution theory, stereotypes, or prejudices or biases that can affect us when we're trying to understand others. It's a good idea to go through the cognitive step of thinking of many different reasons, but then being curious and entering into a dialogue to see if you can really get the other person to define it, especially if you're the manager in charge of dealing with facilitating a conflict in a team, knowing how to dialogue with others so that you can see and understand the complexity of the team you're working with. I know we're all overworked, so that sounds like a big job. It is. You are not wrong. Okay, goals. So let's go into goals. Hawker and Wilmot is really interested in the complexity of goals. So when I use the word complex, those of you in this class who have taken my organizational communication, you know we really want to understand the difference between complicated and complex and use those words very differently. So complex, since that's the one we're focusing on for understanding goals, means that there's a lot of different uh, goals, and the complexity of it means there's a discovery process that needs to happen, and that means we need to understand other people's perceptions and our own intra perceptions, which sometimes it becomes really hard to define what we want in a conflict, right? When we think about the goal, we're thinking about where we're going, what is the end game? Uh, what's the target? Right? So if I'm an archer and I'm aiming for a target, uh, the goal is where I want my arrow to hit. Uh, Even though the archery does include the weapon of, it is a type of weapon. We don't want our goal to be to weaponize what's happening in the situation, right? We are concerned, thumbs up, good, we don't want to weaponize it. Instead, we really want to be more on the task or the problem. And the reason why this is so sometimes so hard for us to even define for ourselves and to have some compassion that it might be hard to define is because goals are always changing. They're always changing. And uh, we also might want a goal, but realize we actually want two different things. We have two different goals. And if we have two different goals, then that means that I might get this one at the sacrifice of the other one. I actually can't have both. Or um, if some if my goal starts changing, I might have to give up a goal and place of a whole new goal that I didn't even know I needed going into the conversation. This is why it's a discovery process and why it's complex. If things were complicated, just because for those of you who haven't taken the org com class, um, that if it's complicated just to define it, it means that there is a fixed goal that we could bring in an expert or we could really move to expertise that can define that goal, and then we have the answer, right? We would want someone who's knows the situation so well that they can move us towards a fixed goal. And that's when things are more complicated than complex. There's like this idea of it, that there's a right answer. Complex means there's not one right answer. Okay. Next. Okay, so let's go through these. There's a topic goal, and I'm looking at the vocabulary sheet that I posted to the class. So the first one is the topic goal. The topic goal is the surface. That one is usually the easiest to define. Most people, if they have a goal, they're going to say the topic goal. That means that it's very clear and perceptible. This is the reason why someone's always coming in late to every single meeting we have, like a habitual lateness we're dealing with, or uh, there is, I thought I was doing this task for the team, but you're doing it. Who's doing this task? Like a topic is just basically that kind of surface piece. And that is usually can be easily agreed on from everybody, but it has some nuance to it. The second one is the relational goal, and this is for um, when we come back to this idea of interdependence, that your actions are affecting me and my actions are affecting you, and how are we're not just single entities with no connection, that we actually have some interdependence. And now remember, that brings us back to Hawker and Wilmot's definition, and the word interdependence is a part of that. Okay, the next thing, identity goals. So this one is identity goals is one of the ones that is usually really amplified in an argument or an adversarial situation, because for some reason, whatever it is, we feel like our identity might be at attack, or someone we don't feel seen, whatever it is, or we feel like someone has decided to define us in a way that we don't feel fits who we are. The truth about identity goals is like we can find identity in almost every conversation. Identity goals are usually overlapping a lot of what's happening and become very can't depending on the individual and of course the context and the situation, because it depends, it can really amplify the conflict or it can overtake the conflict, almost like a tsunami. Like we might be trying to solve this topic goal, and then something happens where, like a tsunami, identity goals become the dominant part of the discussion. And some people, because they have some instinct or awareness of this, they will intentionally attack identity in order to almost sabotage the dialogue. So now the identity goal becomes the topic, and we move away from the exploration of acknowledging responsibilities and how are we going to move into problem solving. If someone can sabotage and move someone into a defensive place of taking care of their identity, sometimes that happens and it's very unintentional, like someone just used a word or framed something in a way that set the other person into a place where they move into that emotional hijacking, flooding place, and they are reminded of past conflicts or identity conflicts that fit their group of people that they feel attached to, and they will then move into a place where they have to repair identity. So we really want to think about how we're being, well, Gottman would say the gentle startup. How are we starting up into conversations so that we can manage all of these different complexity of goals and find ways to acknowledge and take responsibility for how we're using language. The last one is the process goal. And the process goal is, how are we handling this conflict? Like, what's our process for handling it? And some organizations have scripts and processes and human resources, or they have a subgroup for confidentiality that you can go to walk through the process of dealing with a conflict. If that is um, true, sometimes that can be so helpful, right? Like, okay, let's just lean into our organization's process for dealing with this. However, processes notoriously uh, don't deal with context or the situation, or it doesn't really, just like if we go back to the progress triangle, it doesn't really deal with the relational dimensions, or the history that's brought us to this. So you might have one little topic goal, and your organization has a process to deal with it, but it's not really taking into account the historical piece of why we're at this, and it can amplify the issue. The other problem sometimes we come up to in our workplaces is this idea of professionalism, and how the process goal gets kind of in this muck of how will we be professional in our workplace. And that word has often been used as a weapon or a gateway word to limit participation in the organization or in economic mobility for certain groups of people that have been trying to enter into more economic stable positions and places of power and leadership in organizations. And they use professionalism as a gateway word to build a wall to keep out certain groups of people. And being aware of how that word professional is often weaponized in organizations. So process goals, and also process goals, if they're coming from human resources, remember human resources is there for the stability and productivity of the company, which we also talk about in my org com class more, but just put a note into that because we all have to deal with those situations. And it's sometimes why you feel like when you go to human resources for help with a goal, or go to a manager for help with a conflict goal, the process is built with people of power having more stability in the process than the person without power. And often we would rather deal with situations on our own than remind ourselves of the power situation, that the imbalance, different situations of power. Okay, so the chapter has a lot more. And the truth is, I think for goals, even as many as that are defined by Hawker and Wilmot, you could probably even think of another goal. That's how complex they are. So we really want to think of these four as our kind of grounding ones that you should really be able to define going into a conflict. And understand the complexity of how they might shift and change and which ones you have priorities for. And then the process of collaboration, right? Of a collaborative learning process to managing conflict means we are also trying to understand these things from the other person. Now, I definitely think prep work is important. We want to do our prep work going into conversations. We want to be as clear as possible about our interests and our goals. And that's the frame, right? So remember, when we talk about chapter 3 here in week 3 of the term, we're clarification and framing. If you are doing your dialogue more collaboratively, you are leaning in to establishing the frame for all the parties involved in the conflict. And that takes a lot of time. And we're dealing with deadlines and pressures, and we are in school, and we have families, and we have work, and we have friendships we're trying to take care of. And each one of those areas has all the conflicts, and it's like, yeah, I'd rather just stay at home. And if I'm going to be in school, just tell me what I need to do so I can pass this class and be done with it, because of all these other things that I'm trying, the minutia of the complexity of life. Uh, and that is real. That's real life. That's true story. Hashtag facts. we want to acknowledge that what I am talking about takes a lot of time, and time feels often scarce. And then how do you even deal with your own internal dialogue? So when you come into a conflict, come prepared, but come open. That's why I also placed those videos on about the difference between a growth mindset and a fixed mindset. To really manage conflict, you need a growth mindset. If you come into a conflict and maybe you've even tried to manage a conflict with someone who is more fixed, and absolute and unwilling to listen, and anything you brought up was dismissed or rejected or even sometimes attacked, that we're not dealing with a growth mindset when we're in those type of dialogues. And this is when go back to the myths of communication. And sometimes you can come in with all the prep work, the growth mindset, all of these tools and understanding the nuance of culture, and walk away with the exact same problem, right? Uh, it is something that we cannot promise in a class like this that we're going to be able to solve all the conflicts, and knowing when to walk away is really important. Okay. Let's see. Okay, the next thing I'm going to talk about in this video is escalation and de-escalation and the emotional components of uh, dealing with a conflict. This is important because when we are in a conversation, like I said, we're dealing with this identity, which we want to now take also the word identity management and how our public self and our perceived self, our private self, and this is like the presenting public self and our perceived self, we often have in dialogue, we're trying to manage how are we going to keep what we need to private, and which doesn't necessarily mean lying or being a secret, but sometimes some things aren't appropriate, or sometimes something is just none of your business, right? So conversations are dealing with each of us are dealing with what we're willing to disclose, self-disclose, and what we need to manage in relation in the context of that transaction. That means we are need to create strategies for ourselves of how we manage our emotional state and how to de-escalate the situation. How are we de-escalating it? And being mindful. That means that for de-escalation, it's not just what you say, it's how you're listening to the other person. And if you are truly in a place where you can be a listener, you'll be less likely to fall into the um, mirroring and the minutia of the other person's emotional state. And how do you mean? I mean, this takes a lot of practice, and this is very difficult. And it might be just because you might be really good at it in one context or one relationship doesn't mean you will be good at it in another context or another relationship. Uh, but it's how do you maintain your own emotional homeostasis stasis in the presence of the other. As children, we were not every childhood is different, every family is different, every parent is different, and in sibling situations, uh, each child has a different set of parents as well, and that needs to be acknowledged. That you might see a sibling that has a higher level of sensitivity, or is has different things that they get uh, pulled up into that flooding state and escalate with than you. That's usually because parents are different for each kid. Each kid has a different set of parents. Each parents don't have just one kid, they have several different kids. right? And that's where adaptation and understanding how to adapt is really important. So children, uh, to survive, the natural thing a child does is mirror, kinetically mirror and emotionally uh, manage their emotions to manage the adults in their life. So if there is an adult that blows up a lot and maybe it's really random when they're going to have a blow up, a child will start to become hyper aware of the emotional states of the adults around them or the other people around them to be able to survive, to forecast, or when they need to take cover or be ready, whether they have the power to take cover or not. And even if you grow up in a home where you were more emotionally acknowledged and that maybe you had a parent who really tried to lean in and walk you through an emotional state, and that's why the Becky Kennedy videos are really important to go back and watch if you didn't get a chance to think about the how that has changed how has the way adults showed up for you when you were a kid sh- moved to how that affects the patterns and the narratives and the story you tell yourself about who you are when you hit a conflict in your adult life, right? So you hit the wall, you hit a friction point uh, with an organization, with others, and then we move into a narrative about who we are in a conflict, and that usually came from the experiences of our past. Nobody has perfect parents, and the truth is, since perfect parents don't exist, it's really good to acknowledge through love and kindness who you are today, all your successes, and all your things that you love in the world come out of the reactive places of where we've been in that past. So, so I've been using this word flooding. Flooding, let's define flooding, and this is from Gottman's research. Flooding is that place where, in our neuroscience, we're getting into some neuroscience, the different portions of our brain become activated, and we have these your neurons develop pathways of thought, and that's the pattern, right? Scripts and patterns that we fall into, where you want to think of that in your brain, the way the neurons connect as as newly fallen snow on a hillside. And have you ever been the first person to walk in the snow and make your footprints, or your sled was the first sled to go down the hill when it's been snowing, and you carve a path? That's what's really happening when you make a memory in your mind. And that creates a path. And then every time you remember that, you go down that same path again and again and again. If it's a more traumatic memory or a sticky memory, we have a tendency to want to go down that path again and again and again and again to the point of an obsession. And if we're doing that, just like that snowy mountain that had that fresh snow and it blew up around you, and like the snow and the snowflakes, and it was all powdery and soft, that over time your neurons are very soft when they're first developing a memory, but as we remember again and again and again, what we're doing is the snow becomes harder, the neurons become stiffer, we lose some plasticity in the memory, and it gets calcified. There's a calcification in the brain that happens that makes that very fixed and unmovable, and painful every time we go down because the ice is getting harder and harder and harder. We know that when we can talk to someone who's in a listening place, in an empathetic place, and it really takes someone, a professional who has been trained in how to listen to someone who's been through traumatic experiences, where that has gotten into a really hard calcified place. This is why therapists can really be helpful. If we talk, we actually kind of start to break up that ice or that calcification in the brain, and we start to create new pathways. Where if we're in a thinking process, an intra process, that's where we can get looped in. And that's why Becky Kennedy says that sending a kid alone to be isolated um, can be really damaging over time to that kid, because they are now creating a pattern narrative that's becoming calcified. And children will often move into self-blame. And then as adults, we move into self-blame very quickly, if we've had those type of too much isolation experience as children. Okay, so what do? We're in a conflict and things are escalating and we feel like we might be out of control. This actually just happened to me about a month ago, and it was actually a really interesting moment because I teach this and I don't get this was an identity, it felt like an identity attack to me. And I was immediately flooded, and I moved in away from the frontal lobes, where all my reasoning and rationality happened. And I was moving into that amygdala part of the brain, the amygdala hijack. And I probably should have taken a break. But I did at least take a moment to try and get myself settled down. And I immediately moved into meta communication, and I started to meta communicate. I think we have a miscommunication. That's what I said. And it was a very jilted way I said it because I was not in a safe emotional place. And I was like, I think we are having a miscommunication, and I would like to move into perception checking so that we can line up. Like, all of those statements are meta communicating statements that I was trying to manage my emotional state that I was in and the dialogue I was in, because I didn't feel safe enough to walk away from that conversation without a little bit of managing my identity. And that's usually what happens, right? Someone becomes so flooded that they're either going to want to exit, which usually I'm a runner. You don't know who I am? I'm out of here. Bye. Hang up, right? I'm a runner. I'm going to run. Here I go, right? Or we move into being a fuser. And I actually had to go against my natural instincts to just run, to actually lean in a little in a meta communication way. Though I don't think the situation was resolved, I did hang up with a feeling like I was at least acknowledged by the end of that dialogue, which didn't last much longer than that moment. I think I was in the conversation for just about 5 more minutes, which also was me trying to manage the situation. So if we're in an amygdala, the amygdala part of brain hijack, that's the reptilian part of the brain. That is where we have the fight, flight, or freeze reaction. Fight, flight, or freeze. Runner, I'm staying. I'm staying in the fight, or freeze. And freeze is usually, I need more information. I'm not sure what's going on. And if I hold still, maybe I can figure it out, right? That's the freeze part. Okay. So if this happens and we're in, let's say we're in a adversarial kind of escalating argument and we get into this place, if what the fuser is doing is that when they're in the amygdala, they're leaning in and they usually move into defensiveness, sometimes attack, but they also end up in this place of summarizing. And that is like, whether it's the topic, goal, or you can hear when a fuser is summarizing in a summarizing loop, they're in a loop, then what they're doing is you can usually start to hear where the interests and goals are coming out in the way they're forming their narrative. And if you're the person having to listen to someone in an amygdala hijack who's in summarizing, it might be good to move your mind to analyze what are they punctuating in their narrative or story. But the truth is, it's really painful to sit in the presence, being the listener, when you are in this situation. Both people are in extreme pain. We want to say there's a physiological, painful experience. Everyone's going to manifest it differently in their body. And to move away from the pain, usually someone wants to run or someone wants to lean in and move into this fusing uh, place. So, for relief of the pain, right? They're looking for relief of pain. So our fuser needs to understand when they're in an amygdala hijack that what they're demanding from the other person is you're pulling that person into their most painful place that they can be in. And this is where if they have no power, if that other person has no power, and they're forced to stay in the presence of a fuser in an amygdala hijack and a summarizing place, defensiveness, maybe even some attacks in there, then that's when we get stonewalling. Stonewalling is a shutdown. The neurons and the brain and the body are starting to move into a shutdown place as a survival mode. And this is where we see eyes glaze over, where someone is in so much pain, they actually glaze over. Uh, and they're just trying to disengage to survive the situation. We really want to acknowledge in stonewalling that as much as that feels like a weapon, or where are you? Why aren't you listening? Whatever that kind of like feeling of the disengagement from the other person. If we're getting a glazed over situation, that person's in so much physical pain, they can no longer be present to the moment. Let's just take a deep breath as we talk about this. This is hard stuff. When I say take a deep breath, we don't want to just breathe. You want to be conscious of your breath. You want to think about how the breath is coming through your nose. Maybe count it out and then hold it for a certain number of counts. And then very controlling, not just, but control how you exhale. If you can even lean back a little, look up. This can help us with the rest piece of trying to take emotional control. Because I think even as I talk about this, even though we're not in a conflict, this is probably going to start bringing up situations that you've been in, and you might get back on that slippery slope and be in a sticky place with a memory Maybe if you have a handy to make a note, pause this and just make a note of that memory, and then let's put it aside for now so we can get back to the tools that we need. And it will make you think about situations where you could have handled it a bit better. And we always want to remember that important thing: when we know better, we do better. And the forgiveness chapter is the last chapter we do, but it's a good note to think about how we're going to be kind to ourselves as we learn these tools so that we can uh, get to a place where we can be much more productive moving forward. Okay, so where were we? We were still with that fuser and the stonewalling piece. So if someone can have awareness, and if a fuser can even have awareness and call for a break, then that needs to happen. An exiter is, our runners are usually the people with the power to use a break either as a weapon against the other person, or we want to think about how they can use a break as a way to take care of the relationship and find a way to really hold that relationship in a care place, a loving place, or a place of compassion and empathy. So we really want to think about that as well as we're moving forward. So I feel like I'm missing something with the fuser. Okay, whatever I'm missing with the fuser, it's going to come back because I'm going to go back and forth. Let's get to our exiters. Hello, exiters, team exiters, my runners out there like me. My dog just barked. Okay, I'm not sure what's going on, but I will keep going. So sorry, my dog barked and it got my mind switched over. So I got to get back I'm back in my flow, in my zone. Okay, so exiters. Uh, exiters who are leaving, they usually have patterns where they lose power, they've lost voice. They don't feel like they're being listened to. There's no point to this conversation. When they're trying to dialogue with a fuser, before they even get into stonewalling, they might have tried to agree. Agree. Yes, yes, yes. Okay, you are right. I agree with you, right? Whatever it is, they are trying to de-escalate the situation. Um, uh, and the agreement isn't that they really agree. They've just lost their voice completely. They're not really being listened to, and they see that the conversation is now completely pointless. Or there could be other things involved where in a previous, their narrative of their story is, I'm not going to get my way anyway. Why should I even bother? They're very pessimistic about the process, they don't have a good process goal in place. And so there's just no reason to be involved. Or when they're in there, an exiter is also in an amygdala hijack, right? It's fight, flight, or freeze, flight, that they become hyper aware of danger and they see the conflict itself and the conversation and talking as dangerous. And they've identified that as being dangerous and they're going to want to run, right? So in the amygdala hijack for the fuser or for the exiter, they are, when they're in the frozen place or the fight place or the flight place, they are in a hyper awareness. Their heart rates are up. There's a surge of adrenaline. That's part of the painful experience, is this surge of adrenaline. And the only thing they're really going to be able to perceive is anything they think is dangerous. And they are in a place of fear. And so true reasoning, right? They're disconnected from the frontal lobes. They aren't really listening. So that means that every that's why you might say something that you feel like is a way to appease the situation, but someone could latch onto one word and they see that word as dangerous, and they're going to move like a fuseral hyper focus on the danger. And so if an exeter is hyper focused that the conflict is now dangerous, or I'm experiencing that feeling of adrenaline, and as I am the danger, and I can't control my emotional state, and I need to get out, I need to exit. Um, and it's like the vibration is like a earthquake, and there's this feeling of an explosion is about ready to happen. And I want my for other people to be safe. I don't want to damage this relationship. I don't want to be seen. This is a highly vulnerable and frightening feeling, and I don't want to be seen while I'm experiencing whatever that emotional eruption, whatever that looks like. I need to run and hide, or I need to run and get out of here. And this causes, when we're in complementary flooding patterns, our reaction of being a fuser makes an exeter exit more, which makes the fuser want to chase and go after the chase. And they want to run after the other person. And this is where you might get 20 phone calls in a row, or 20 texts, or DMing, and it's like this constant need to connect to connect. That's the fusing. I want to fuse. They're leaning in to that as their amygdala hijack, and where they've been disconnected from reasoning. And the exeter in reaction is not going to answer and not going to answer and not going to answer. And to the point of we're getting to that ghosting place with it. So so what do we do? Let's get to solutions. I've spent enough time defining this. I think you understand what's happening. So Gottman says when you are in this infinity loop, what you need to do is establish a process goal of how you deal with a conflict when either person or both people are in an amygdala hijack or a flooded state. So this means that we are now going to make an agreement about what we're going to do, right? That means you need to have a meta communication, and you need to agree before you're in the hijack. You need to agree when we're all in our frontal reasoning, our emotional states are very calm, and we can really dialogue and talk about and be seen and acknowledge who we are and who the other person is. And the agreement is when we need to allow our exiters to exit. We need to give permission for them to exit and fusers not to chase. Exiters need to agree to meta communicate that they need a break and how long a break do they need, and they need to promise when they will return. Now, Gottman has has really changed, the research has really shifted that breaks shouldn't be that long. They should be pretty, uh, you should return as soon as you feel like you can. I definitely think it should be within 12 hours. Gottman recommends, I think, even less than that. I've heard 3 hours. I feel like I hear quite a few. Esther Perel talks about this as well. And sometimes it only needs to be 5 or 10 minutes of the break. Um, there should, in a break where you actually are in separate locations, both people need to self-soothe and get back to a regulated state. Uh, and my exeter, when you exit, even when you say, I just need a moment to take care of myself, to gather my thoughts, oh, I promise to be back in 30 minutes. And in 30 minutes is at this time, I will make sure I contact you or be back here by that point, right? So when you meta communicate all that as an exiter, because the fuser, as soon as you leave, they are going to move into an extremely painful crash. And that's because the talking and the relationship was staying off the pain. And without you, they are going to have a full embodied painful experience. And that is why my fusers need to find a way to self-soothe and do self-care to pull yourself through that pain. You don't want to deny the pain. You want to acknowledge that it's there. You want to pull the pain out of you and really look at it. That's hard to do. So if you have someone else you can talk to who you're not in a conflict with, who can be, has a, maybe has even has 1 minute to say, are you okay? What's going on? Are you okay? And they say, oh no, I just was in a argument with so and so and I'm totally flooded. And they're like, well, just tell me, I don't really have too much time. Just tell me what happened. And you can just say it and like, okay, I only had a minute and thank you for letting me know what's going on. You're going to be okay. I can talk to you again later. Right. So just having someone listen to you articulate what even is the conflict can start to bring a fuser back to a regular level. Not the person that you're actually in a conflict with. That person is in their own emotional amygdala hijack, and you want to call a friend in order to catch their contagion of calmness. So back to my example, that few minutes I had where we meta communicated and perception checked, and then I hung up, I had to call a friend. Even if I'm around, I had to call a friend to cut myself to calm down and make sure that, because I knew I was going to a place that wasn't reasonable about defining the situation. And I was trying to open myself up to listen to the other person, not just move in my own summary. So it actually had to talk to two different people. Um, and those two different people each said the same thing about what had happened in the conflict. And both those people know me really well. And they used words that I could latch onto, like a lifeline, and use it to pull myself out of being in my amygdala hijack too long. And then I did hashtag floor time, which I think is trending on social media right now. But hashtag floor time means I laid on my back on the floor and I put my legs up on the wall. You can do this also with a couch or a chair where you just set your feet up on something. And I put my hands on my diaphragm and I just did some very slow, counted, purposeful breaths until I got myself calmed down. And that only actually took a couple minutes. And then I was doing much better. I still felt the injury of the conversation. Uh, it doesn't really excuse the behavior or the injury or the situation, but I want to be in a rational place where I can look at it instead of it being a flooding of tsunami that pulls me out and I get into a sticky place where the memory becomes calcified, which I didn't want to do. Okay. My exiter also has to do self-soothing, which might mean calling a friend as well, but usually you're talked out when you're the exiter. Uh, so there's both, whatever you do, it doesn't really matter whether you're an exit or fuser. Everyone's going to have their own style of emotionally taking control back from the amygdala hijack. So that could be taking a walk or some type of physical activity, activating the calf or thigh muscles is really important because it pumps, because your adrenaline is going through your body and you're getting that flooded state of hormones and things. Those are your biggest muscle groups of your body, and activating your thighs or your calf muscles gets the blood pumping through, and we can start cleansing and calming down from the hormones that have been released that get your adrenaline and cortisol up. It could be journaling, right? Some people really discover that when they write, they really are figuring out their thinking process. All those goals and interests, they get muddled up when we're in actual dialogues, and maybe you need to tease that out again and find the individual threads. And sometimes we only do that by writing or journaling our thought process. Uh, the other things I've heard students talk about is really, like focused breathing, there's physical activity, and there is talking, the phone a friend, uh, trying to think other things, art, music. Music is a wonderful way because it's so connected to our emotional life, and the way that we process language, and it can move art, music, or some type of creativity endeavor, can pull even cooking, cooking a meal. I think there's a Grey's Anatomy in season 1 where I forget her name, the blonde doctor, she's really upset and she bakes like muffins and cookies and all this stuff. And she's doing this creative endeavor to move her mind. And as soon as you do that, you connect your left and right hemispheres, and you can start to move back into a more rational place about thinking about the conflict. So the first time you agree on a break with someone, it's gonna be really difficult to take that very first break. Uh, and that's because there's not a lot of trust yet been built up, or the reliability or the consistency. So you exiters have a lot of power in this situation as soon as you leave. And the way that you return and how the return happens is really going to be that finite moment. As Brené Brown calls one of those trust marbles that we're going to get put in our jar, and how we move into a gentle startup, how we do self-soothing, how are we going to acknowledge and move back into dialogue. Uh, but over time, if it happens again and again, and there's consistency and reliability, we are moving into that leadership piece of building trust. And when we build trust, we start filling our marble jar up, and it's really those little moments. So this is some of the things that I wanted to talk about in this lecture. Boy, this lecture went really long, almost 90 minutes. But I hope it gave you some information for how to be in a conversation and a dialogue. And I can't wait to talk to people in the class and hear your take on as we move forward. Bye.